to do, and we'll use a large portion of the plant's electricity and make it much more expensive to produce electricity with coal. But the real kicker is that the insurance industry wants nothing to do with this, because when you pump carbon dioxide into a big hole in the ground, it's under pressure, and it may eventually leak and come back out again. And if it comes back out in a place where people are living, if there's any kind of depression in the geography, it will pool in that depression, because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, and it will suffocate everybody and everything, including the animals. So it is not a proven technology. It is possible to show in one instance that, like, for example, there is a coal plant in Wyoming that is sending its exhaust gas through a large pipe into Saskatchewan in Canada, and they're pumping that exhaust gas into the ground in order to increase the recovery of heavy oil. In other words, they're pressurizing the oil field down there with this exhaust gas from a coal plant. And it's kind of ironic because they are capturing carbon from the coal plant's exhaust in order to get more carbon out of the ground in the form of heavy oil. So it's rather self-defeating from any kind of climate policy point of view. But this example is always pointed to as an example of how there really can be clean coal. It isn't going to happen. This is one of the few predictions I was made, because as you know, I'm not big on predictions, because I don't think we do actually have a crystal ball to predict the future. But one thing I would predict is that clean coal won't come true. It's a fairy tale promoted by the coal industry in order to make us think that coal is clean, when in fact it is the most harmful thing we do to the environment and to our health. Although that doesn't mean I'd say, okay, shut all the coal plants down, because that's 50% of U.S. electricity. We have to transition into cleaner technologies, and that will take time.
I did a piece last year on wind and was shocked to find out that wind energy is way more expensive and not consistent in terms of delivering the energy, and that it's way more complex in terms of being able to rely on it than it's made to be. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, the big fantasy about wind and solar is that it is somehow reliable and can replace large, continuous power like coal and nuclear and hydroelectric. It simply cannot, because we don't have the storage ability except in very unique cases. For example, one of my favorite examples is in my book, is that the Swiss buy surplus French nuclear energy at night very cheap. They get it a lot cheaper than you could get wind energy, because the French have no use for it at night because the load is so low, yet they have to keep the reactors running. And so the Swiss buy this energy for probably tenths of a cent per kilowatt hour and pump water up into hydroelectric dams in the Alps. And then the next morning, they run that water through turbines and sell the electricity to the Italians at a profit. So there's an example. That's called pump storage. And there is an example where you can actually store quite large amounts of energy that is taken from an electricity plant and put it into a hydro dam up in the mountains and run it through turbines in the morning. But these are limited applications. You have to have a big source of water, or else you have to have two lakes, one above the other, and then in the day you run the water into the bottom lake, and at night you pump the water back up with surplus electricity into the top lake. That works, but you can imagine it's only going to be applicable under certain circumstances. The real problem, though, is if you use wind energy to pump the water up, now your electricity is not only 2 or 3 times as expensive as regular energy, but it's 5 or 6 times as expensive, because you have had to do all this pumping as well as all of the wind. And then one night there's no wind, and so you don't get any water up into the dam the next morning, and then you don't have any electricity. So this is, wind and solar both have these two fundamental weaknesses. Intermittency, meaning it isn't available on demand, and on demand is a fundamentally important factor with any kind of energy source. Your car, for example, has a tank of gas in it. That tank of gas sits there for a month, and then it's available, boom, when you want it, on demand, and any day. You just have to go fill it up. If you don't remember to do that, well, you haven't got a very sustainable situation. But solar is the same, only solar costs 6 to 10 times as much as regular energy to begin with, and it isn't available even as much as wind is. In a good wind area, you will get 30% what's called capacity factor, which means that if you have 1,000 megawatt of wind, you get 300 megawatts out of that wind farm. And part of the time there'll be no wind when there isn't any energy coming from it. And the question is, what do you do then? Well, you have to build a gas plant, which is reliable and can be started up when the wind stops. So why not just build a gas plant, one might ask, because why would you build this giant wind farm that costs a fortune and the electricity from which costs 2 or 3 times as much as the electricity from a gas plant? Why not just build a gas plant? Well, there comes the climate argument saying, well, when the wind is blowing, you don't have to run the gas plant, and that saves on greenhouse gas emissions, which is true if you think it's worth it. And, you know, as you know, in my book, I come down to the last chapter, Climate of Fear, in which I question whether or not we know that it's worth it to do that. And if you don't really know it's worth it to do that, you should start thinking a little bit more about it, and that takes you back to the beginning of the book.
From a climate perspective, though, if the public accepts that carbon dioxide is not food for plants and nourishment for human beings and animals, but accepts the EPA translation that carbon dioxide is a toxin, then it seems like that trumps all other logic and understanding, because then it's all about the greenhouse gases and it's all about carbon dioxide. It's all centered on this seed.
That is right, Kim, and that is the nub of the issue, is that we have had created for us an overarching situation where climate change is absolutely paramount. Everything else must fit under that umbrella, because we are doomed to fry in hell if we continue to live this carbon-rich life that we have today. And I'm of two minds about it, because I believe it is very important for us to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, but not necessarily because of the climate issue, because we're just too dependent on them and they are non-renewable, and we're not conserving them like we should be, where there are other technologies that can do the job just as well or better and cleaner than if we use a fossil fuel. That's where we should be going, which is why I'm in favor of electrifying vehicles and in favor of ground source heat pumps in buildings to replace natural gas, and in favor of nuclear and hydroelectric energy, which are a reasonable price and reduce fossil fuel consumption. So I'm in favor of all those things, yet at the same time, I do not buy into the idea that carbon dioxide is toxic. That is ridiculous, because it is the most important nutrient for all life on Earth. I'm looking out the window at all the trees and plants coming out in the springtime here, and the reason they are able to do that is because they are eating the carbon dioxide in the air. It is their primary nutrient. The other nutrients, of course, are water, rainfall, and some smidgen of minerals from the soil. But a plant is mainly made up of air and water, and the air part is carbon dioxide. I mean, it's a miracle that these plants can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere when it's only at 390 parts per million. For example, aquatic life, fish living in the ocean, as soon as the oxygen content gets down below about 5 parts per million, they start to suffer. And so, and that's amazing that they can survive on that. I mean, it is, sorry, I meant 5%, not 5 parts per million, at 5% level. So the plants are, in fact, what my research has shown very clearly, that the plants that are living on this earth today would actually prefer to have a carbon dioxide level 4 or 5 times higher than it is now. And whereas Al Gore can get away with saying that CO2 has never been higher than it is now in the last 800,000 years, 800,000 years isn't even halfway back to the beginning of the present ice age. But if you look at the longer term of life on Earth, carbon dioxide has actually never been lower than it is now through most of the history of life. And that is a fact. I mean, it's